Good afternoon and hello. My name is Kathy Schultz and I am the Water Education Specialist with the California Department of Water Resources. And I'd like to welcome you to Water Wednesdays. Today we are talking about salmon. This is actually the fourth part in our series on salmon, during which we have been following them through their life cycle. If you weren't able to join us for the first three presentations, we started out with the adults returning to the Feather River up near Oroville and spawning or laying their eggs there. The following week, we learned about how the eggs hatch into alvin and then the alvin grow into fry, still up again in the upper Feather River near Lake Oroville. And then last week, we learned about how as the fry grow older and start to move downstream, some of the lucky ones can find refuge on floodplains and have an opportunity to find lots of good food and safe habitat to grow really big in. And all of these are available on our YouTube channel. So as I said, last week we heard about the fry. We heard from Haley Wright about the salmon that find refuge and habitat specifically on the Yolo floodplain, where DWR is doing some projects to help improve the habitat and improve access for salmon to the floodplain. Well, today we're going to move further downriver as the salmon continue their journey out to sea, and we're going to be hearing about what the salmon do in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta and upper San Francisco Bay estuary. This is their last stop before they head to the ocean and the last chance for us here at DWR to study them, at least until they return again as those adults that we started this series off with. The mission of the California Department of Water Resources is to sustainably manage the water resources of California in cooperation with other agencies to benefit the state's people and protect, restore, and enhance the natural and human environments. Salmon, just like people, rely on healthy environments. And when we protect salmon and salmon habitat, we're not only making sure that these amazing fish continue to inhabit our rivers and our delta, but we are helping maintain a healthy ecosystem for everyone who relies on it. And the delta that I keep referring to is one of the most important ecosystems for salmon and for people in all of California. And I have Dr. Brett Harvey is here with us today to talk about the salmon and the delta and the work that he does there. So before I turn things over to Brett, I just want to go through a few logistics. If you are joining us for the first time and you are joining us on Zoom, we would love to hear from you. We would love to hear from you through the chat box. However, please do keep your videos off and your microphones muted. We don't want to hear the leaf blowers or the barking dogs. But if you have any questions during or after Brett's presentation, you just go down to the bottom of your screen, click on the little speech bubble that says chat, and you can go ahead and ask any questions that you have about the salmon or the delta. And I will get to as many of them as I can. I think that covers it. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, we don't have a question option, but we hope you enjoy the presentation as well. And without anything else from me, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Brett. All you.
I'll unmute myself.
All right.
So hi, I just want to say hi to everyone before we get started, and thanks, Kathy. And I'll start the slideshow without further ado because I put way too many slides in here. You might hear a little paper rustling as we go through. I'm reading off notes. All right, let's see if I can figure out how to do this. All right, should be good to go. So as Kathy said, today I'm going to talk about the journey of juvenile salmon through the Central Valley Delta and the San Francisco estuary on their way to the ocean. I'll talk about some of the challenges they face along that journey and some of the things that we are doing to help make that journey more successful. You may have noticed that in my title, I don't call this a journey. I call it a migration, which is a movement from one place to another, in this case from rivers to the ocean, and rearing, which means helping something or someone to grow up. Like Emily was rearing chickens in her backyard. That's because the whole time these little salmon are traveling through the delta and the estuary on their way to the ocean, they have to keep growing. or they'll never make it. Can you think of any reason why they have to keep growing? Well, we'll talk more about that later. So we can get this to advance. There we go. First, let's talk a little bit about the salmon life cycle to put everything into context, since some of you probably already know about some of this. Baby salmon hatch from eggs buried in the gravel. After using up their yolk sac, they wiggle their way out of the gravel as fry. They migrate down the rivers toward the ocean as parr, rearing and growing all along the way. They transition to saltwater living as smolts and spend anywhere from 6 months to 8 years in the ocean, usually 1 to 4 years, eating and growing. Then they find their way back to the place where they were born. They spawn, laying their eggs in the gravel. Finally, they die, and their rotting carcasses provide fertilizer for algae and food for bugs, which their babies will need in order to eat and grow after they hatch. And the whole life cycle starts over again. I hope you're starting to understand and notice a theme here, a word I keep repeating that's very important in determining whether baby salmon makes it from here, emerging out of the gravel, to here, all grown up and laying eggs to make new baby salmon. The word is grow. To complete this incredible life cycle, salmon need to grow. The bigger and faster they grow, the better chance they have of surviving. Especially as they move down the rivers, through the delta and estuary, and in their first 6 months or so in the ocean, they need to grow. Of the thousands of salmon that hatch out of each nest in the gravel, only a very small number make it back to spawn. Incidentally, does anyone know what a red nest is called? Oh, I said the word. I meant to say what a salmon nest is called. I gave it away. If less than 2 salmon from each red makes it back and spawns, we get fewer and fewer salmon making it back each year. That's pretty much the direction we've been headed for the past 100 years, with fewer salmon making it back decade after decade. At some point in the future, if we keep headed this way, no salmon will make it back. They'll spiral into extinction. On the other hand, if we can get more salmon to survive, then each year we can get more and more salmon coming back. So what do you think happens to all those other salmon, the ones that don't make it back? Why don't they survive? Most of them get eaten by predators. And most of them get eaten when they are still very small and making their way to the ocean, or in their first months or so in the ocean. If they go into deeper water on the way downstream, they get eaten by bigger fish. If they go into shallower water where the bigger fish don't like to go, they get eaten by birds. The most surefire way to not get eaten is to grow. Think about it. Most of these predators don't have hands to grab and hold and tear up their prey. Mostly they just gulp their prey down whole. So the faster salmon grows, the bigger and faster they get, and fewer predators can catch them and fit them in their mouths. Also, when salmon first get to the ocean, there's not always a lot of food there. Food availability in the ocean can change a lot throughout the year. So salmon that get bigger and fatter before they make it to the ocean may have a better chance of surviving if there's not much food in the ocean when they get there. So we scientists ask ourselves, thinking about the salmon life cycle, what can we do to help more salmon survive to adulthood and get more and more salmon coming back each year instead of fewer and fewer salmon? We can't do a lot to change ocean conditions, but we can do things to help them grow and survive before they get to the ocean. Last week, my friend and colleague Haley talked about things we're doing in rivers to help salmon, like restoring floodplains and getting more fish onto the floodplains, because we've learned that juvenile salmon grow really fast on floodplains. But not all juvenile salmon spend all or even most of their time in the rivers. Some do, and then rush out through the estuary as fast as they can as smolts. But some head down to the estuary earlier as parr and spend a good amount of their time rearing and growing in the estuary. Some of them even migrate downstream as fry and spend most of their time rearing in the estuary. Gotta take a drink of water. If you're like most people I know, you're probably wondering, where the heck is the delta and the estuary, and what are they? If you take a look at a map of California's Central Valley, you'll notice that it's like a big bowl ringed in on all sides by mountains. You'll also notice that it's a pretty big chunk of California. A closer look shows that all the water from the rain and melting snow that drains off this big bowl and down the rivers and streams has only one place to get to the ocean. Through the San Francisco Bay and under the Golden Gate Bridge. It's the same for salmon. If we take an even closer look at this area, we can see it's like a funnel, which all the salmon have to pass through to get to the ocean. At the top of the funnel is the upper estuary, which includes the triangle-shaped area where all the Central Valley rivers come together. This triangle area is called the delta. So in fact, the delta is actually a part of the upper estuary. It's the most upstream part where the rivers first meet the tides. So the water is usually pretty fresh in the delta. The other part of the upper estuary, downstream of the delta, is Suisun Bay and Suisun Marsh, which are usually kind of salty, but not super salty. And then downstream of this is the lower estuary, which is mostly big open bays of saltier water. So that answers the question, where's the estuary? But what is an estuary? An estuary is the place where fresh water flowing down the rivers meets the salty water pushed up by the ocean tides. Estuaries are typically great places for fish to grow because there's usually a lot of food there compared to rivers, unless you're talking about floodplains, of course. Since our upper estuary is less salty than our lower estuary, it's typically considered a better place for salmon that aren't ready to smolt yet. Back in the early 1800s, our upper estuary was a totally different kind of place than it is now. It was a vast area of continuous marsh, full of tiny channels that were lined with plants, like the tule in this old picture. It was so vast that people traveling between Sacramento and San Francisco by boat or on foot would often get lost. But things have changed a lot since then. To give you an idea of how much things have changed, here's a picture showing how much marsh habitat used to exist in the upper estuary. Notice the gray shaded area. That was all marsh habitat. Notice how many tiny, curvy, dead-end channels there are, each channel forking into smaller and smaller channels like the roots of a tree. This kind of a channel network is called dendritic. You can get an idea of what these marshes were like from some photos I took of remnant marsh that we still have left. The edges of these marsh channels were and are lined with vegetation and mud that just crawls with bugs. And the water teems with other kinds of swimming bugs, all fish food. The nooks and crannies along the edges are lined with plant roots, which provide places where salmon can hide from predators and chill out long enough to eat all those bugs. Some of these crevices are so deep you can stick your whole arm in there and not even reach the back. It's a great place for little salmon to hide out. Compare that with what things look like today in a large part of the estuary. Can you find any gray shaded area on the right where we still have some marsh? It's not easy. Most of it's gone, and most of those tiny, curvy channels have been filled in. Most of the channels that are left have been straightened and made deeper and narrower, and many of them are lined with big rocks called riprap, which doesn't grow nearly as many bugs and doesn't give little salmon any place to hide from predators. Remember the dendritic network we used to have? In a large part of the delta, that's been converted to a crisscross maze. In a dendritic network of channels, salmon may go up tiny dead-end side channels on incoming tides and hang out, but they always wind up back in the main channel headed downstream. But in a crisscross network of deep, fast-flowing channels, salmon can get lost in a hurry. And since many of these channels are rip-wrapped and full of predators, the longer the salmon are lost in this maze, the more chance they have of being eaten before they find their way out of the maze to better habitat downstream. So can you think of anything we might do to make things better for salmon as they migrate and rear in the estuary? One thing we're doing is trying to steer salmon away from the mazy parts of the delta so we can keep them away from the scary places and get them into happier places. I'm wondering here if mazy is even a word, but I'm going to keep using it. For example, last week on Water Wednesday, my friend Haley talked about the big notch planned for the Fremont Weir, which is pictured here. This notch will get more little salmon out of the Rip Rap River and over the weir and swimming down the Yellow Bypass floodplain. These salmon will also completely bypass the mazy part of the delta. We're also experimenting with things like this floating wall to steer migrating juvenile salmon the right direction at other channel junctions that lead to the maze. But we also need good places where we can steer salmon to, or toward, I should say. Here's a map showing the thousands of acres of marsh habitat we've rebuilt or are planning to rebuild in the near future. This new habitat will help salmon of all sizes as they move through the estuary. It'll help bigger salmon avoid predators and get some food so they are nice and fat when they get to the ocean. And it will help smaller par and fry by giving them a place to stop and hang out for weeks or months while they continue to grow. We're also doing a bunch of science studies to figure out how to make this new habitat as good as we can for salmon. We're putting salmon in floating cages in marshes all across the estuary to see what kind of habitat lets them grow faster. Here's what the floating cages look like when we aren't checking on the fish. Another thing we're doing is using trawl nets to look for salmon to see what kind of estuarine habitat they like to hang out in. But salmon are really hard to catch with nets in good marsh habitat because they're usually hiding in all those nooks and crannies along the edges. So we're also looking for salmon using environmental DNA. We humans are all constantly sloughing off bits of ourselves, like dried skin, our hair, and it's the same with salmon, except with them it's not hair and skin, it's more like slime. That slime has bits of salmon DNA. If a salmon is close enough, when we take a water sample, we can detect that sloughed off DNA in the water. And there's, I put Tiago over there on the right there. He's the UC Davis student who's running that whole eDNA thing. An even cooler thing we're doing is looking at salmon ear bones and eyeballs. These body parts add layers as salmon grow, like rings on a tree or layers on an onion. Each time a layer is added, it incorporates a chemical signature from the place where the salmon was when that layer was added. We can look back through these layers, analyze the chemicals in each layer, and it's like looking back through time. We can tell where a fish went and how much time it stayed there. We can even tell how fast they were growing in those places by the width of the rings, just like a tree. You may ask, why do we want to know where salmon are using, why do we want to know where salmon are using trawls and eDNA, or figure out where they've been and how long they've been there by using their ear bones and eyeballs? We figure if salmon find a lot of food somewhere, they'll stay there. And if they aren't getting eaten by predators, then more and more salmon will end up in the same spot. These places with lots of salmon, or places where ear bones and eyeballs show salmon spend a lot of time, must be good habitat. Basically, we're letting the salmon show us what good habitat looks like. Then we can use this information for future restoration projects to help us design and build the best habitat possible. So those are just some of the things going on for salmon in the estuary. There's many other people from different government agencies and universities, landowners, farmers, bird hunters, all working on restoration projects and science studies and coming up with new ideas to improve salmon survival and growth in the estuary and throughout the Central Valley. And more, we're working together and sharing information to help recover Central Valley salmon populations. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. Done.
Thank you, Brett. That was really, really interesting.
Hopefully I didn't go too fast.
No. I don't know. I can't speak for the other participants, but we've got some questions coming in. So I will go ahead and start with some of those. One of the questions is, you talked about the salmon slime, like the salmon are, if anybody's ever gone fishing, they know they're kind of slimy when you try and grab one.
Yeah.
And so the eDNA, the environmental DNA that you can get off of them, what sort of things can you tell? Does it just tell you that, hey, there's salmon here, or are you able to take it down to a finer level than that?
At this point, it's just salmon. So we have a really broad, all salmon share certain parts of their genome. So you try and look for those parts that all salmon share, because typically when you're running these assays, if we were looking for winter run, we could probably do them for just winter run salmon, which is a specific run. We have 4 runs in the Central Valley. But in this case, we're just trying to look for any salmon. So you probably could target it, but at this point, it's just, it's all salmon that we're looking for.
Okay. And then you use the ear bones and the eyeballs to determine a little more specifically where the different salmon have come from.
Right, and that's really cool. They actually have a laser. I feel like I'm on, what's that show? I forgot. Anyway, some evil person with their laser, but they shoot these lasers to pinpoint little spots on the ear bones, and then the smoke that's coming off is analyzed, and they can tell all sorts of stuff about the chemicals that's actually in the ear bone.
Oh,
and then they combine that with the width, so they can say, like, okay, it was in this habitat and it grew this fast and it was there.
Okay. And do you get to play with the lasers, or are you more out?
Oh, I don't do that stuff.
No.
Those are highly trained technicians. Most of it goes on at UC Davis. I think there's a lab at Berkeley and Santa Cruz as well.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do when you go out into the Delta? When you go out in the field, are you catching the salmon or?
We are catching the salmon. So most of what I've been working on is the cage part of the study. I mentioned we have a lot of collaborators that are working, and we sort of partition up the different parts of the study. But I've gone out and participated in lots of the field studies. But when we run the nets, we actually tow the nets and then pull them in and measure the salmon. We're actually keeping all the salmon at this point because we wanted to be able to do these chemical tests on them.
Okay.
We don't catch very many, by the way. We got a lot of money, but we were having a really hard time catching them. So now we're having people participate from all these other surveys trying to get us some salmon from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm losing the question.
It was a little bit, what was a typical day for you when you get to go out into the field?
So typical days, you get up way earlier than
not in a lab being an evil scientist with lasers.
You get up in the dark, you pack your lunch, and we meet at a boat dock. And then I usually don't drive the boat. Michelle, who's our field lead, Michelle Nelson, drives the boat. And we just drive all over the Delta. We put on dry suits and jump in the water. And sometimes you have to get in the water, and we float the cages up. So there's just a little bit left in the water, get the fish out. We used to measure them on boards and try and weigh them, which is really hard on a rocking boat. Scales have to be steady. So now we take photographs of them, and there's a guy, Davis, Eric Holmes, who's figured out how to use different measurements of the fish to figure out how much they weigh. And it's more accurate than a scale, actually, in the field. So we do that. We take water samples. We sample bugs, and just anything that we can do quickly. This year, we're actually going to go out and do some really in-depth stuff. We're going to only go to a few sites and really drill down. We're going to collect pieces of the food web from all over and do all these chemical tests on them, again, to try and figure out where salmon are getting their energy from. And if there's anything we can do to improve it.
Okay, wow. So you mentioned California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, UC Davis. It sounds like you have a lot of different partners working on
You
this.
see, so some are actual primary investigators that are working on our study.
Mhm.
So we have NOAA Fisheries. We have some people from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. Um, we have anyone you can think of. We're being funded by the Bureau of Reclamation.
Mhm.
Um, but we also have collaborators from UC Berkeley and the U.S. Geological Survey, where they're doing similar studies, and we're matching our sites up so we can get better information for both of our studies and share information. It's a huge effort. I'd say that just on our study alone, we probably got 20 people doing field work. We've
Mhm.
got probably another 20 people doing support work, and then that's not even mentioning all the people that help us with contracts and all the money stuff. I mean, there's hundreds of people involved with this, any one of these studies.
So studying salmon and protecting salmon is a big project that takes
Did I
over.
mention student volunteers? So
No.
I'm not accepting student volunteers right now, but one of our contractors actually had some high school students in
Mhm.
Marin. That's where their lab is, helping sort bugs. And we have some of the people in the photos were UC Davis volunteers getting
Mhm.
experience doing field work and collecting eDNA
Great.
samples.
So what's your background? Did you volunteer on a project like this and get hooked by salmon, or how did you get into this?
I like to go fishing.
Okay.
I grew up in California. I grew up fishing in mountain streams mostly and in coastal streams. And then I went to school and became an actor.
Okay.
So I have an undergraduate in theater arts,
Mhm.
but I kept complaining a lot about like the environmental damage I was seeing, and my wife finally got tired of hearing me complain and told me to go back. Why not go back to school? So I did exactly that. I started volunteering. I volunteered with the Soil Conservation Service. I can't remember all the places I volunteered, like
Mhm.
regional parks, different government agencies. I traveled all up and down the state. I wasn't sure quite what I wanted to do, but I gradually started to hone in on fish just because I've always had an interest in creeks. I grew up dredging up and down creeks. And
Mhm.
eventually I took me 2 or 3 years of applying for fellowships essentially until I got a fellowship that allowed me to go to graduate school.
Wow. That's that's a great path and a lot of
So I
persistence.
started my career rather late.
That's okay. I think it's acceptable these days to have more than one career or a late starting
Thank you to my wife for supporting me through it all.
career. Sounds like a great person. Um, what have you found? This is a fairly recent project you're doing, but have there been any findings that have helped you identify like where are good sites for salmon, or what kind of restoration projects are effective in creating good habitat?
Yes, and I remember my homework was to actually put some cool slides in showing that, and I forgot.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, we definitely, there's some really interesting stuff happening. Well, first of all, we were finding that the estuary is full of salmon when we have a lot of rain early in the year. Lots of fry come down, they get blown down, or they choose to move down when we have these high flows that are like with lots of mud in the water where they have cover from the predators, and then they sort of filter out or trickle out into all these little habitats and then end up growing there. But then we have a dry year and we have almost no salmon showing up, wild salmon showing up until they release the hatchery fish, which move through, much later in the year. So not a lot of rearing going on in dry years. And so then their question is that because we need that flow to make the habitat suitable for salmon? Do they just not like it? Or are they just not making it there because they have to go through that maze of the delta? And on a dry year, it takes a long time to get through. And the longer you hang out somewhere, the better chance you have of getting eaten, and they just don't make it. So we're actually analyzing we don't have the growth measurements on this last year's fish yet, but just from the guys in the field, they're saying, oh, they grew just as fast as the wet year. So it suggests that the habitat's there, the fish just aren't getting there. And then I just was on a call today where some really interesting stuff came out. They're finding that one of the biggest causes of the salmon dying before they can get downstream is high temperatures.
Mhm.
So when the water temperatures heat up too much earlier in the season, the fish just stop making it out when it hits a certain threshold. for a number of reasons, because the salmon need more food. There's not as much oxygen in the water. Colder water has more oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
And then the salmon, they can't swim as fast to get away from predators. And also when it gets warmer, predators need more food. And so they're much more active. So the salmon are less able to get away, and the predators are a lot hungrier. So it's just really interesting, this idea that maybe this water that's closer to the bay is cooler, especially the islands there's islands with marsh on them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we have to figure out how to get the salmon down there early.
Okay. So we had a question about how the ecosystem change in the Delta, especially rapid ecosystem change, is affecting salmon migration. I think you kind of covered that there with the change with the maize and the warmer temperatures.
Yeah, those maize, the changes with the maize happened like 100 years, like 50 to 100 years ago,
mm-hmm.
primarily.
Yeah.
So it's nothing that, like, most people alive had nothing to do with that.
Okay. Yeah, I think they actually started channelizing the Delta not long after the gold rush to help get the boats from the bay up to Sacramento. So
exactly.
That's been a long process.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No worries. So we have time, I think, for one more question. We're going a little bit over, but this is a really, really interesting topic. And that last question is, you talked about the things that the different agencies are doing and in partnership with the universities, these big studies, these big restoration projects. Are there things that the individuals watching today can do to help salmon basically make it to adulthood? Like you said, get big, grow, and make it out to sea.
So, yeah, I kind of touched on this a little bit. I think about this. I don't think a lot of people are going to be able to go out and, well, you can go fishing and catch a lot of predators if you like to go fishing.
Mm-hmm.
But most people do catch and release, which is fine. But really, I think the number one thing that we can all do is to do our part to slow climate change. More and more, it looks like the biggest threat to salmon in the Central Valley is going to be rising water temperatures that are going to force them to have to get out faster.
Mm-hmm.
So they won't be able to rear as long in the rivers, and hopefully the ocean they'll probably still be cool enough for them. But I would say number one is contribute to the conversation and do your part. And the second one is conserve water, because we need that water. We actually purchase the water in order to release it to push the salmon downstream.
Oh.
And we're working with like farmers, like I said, and various water agencies. We're all trying to figure out how to use that water as efficiently as we can, so we can still farm and get food, we can still drink, and we can still maintain sanitation,
Mm-hmm.
but still keep this ecosystem, or try and recover this ecosystem as much as possible. And that's going to take water.
Right. Great. So
Another
cutting our
climate
carbon
change related thing.
No, that's great. Cutting our carbon emissions and conserving water, two things that will help out so many things right now. Thank you, Brett. This was really, really interesting. And I want to thank everybody who joined us from home today. We have one more presentation in our salmon series, and that is going to be with a guest speaker. So far with Water Wednesdays, all of our presenters have been from the Department of Water Resources, because we do have such amazing scientists doing such fascinating work. And you can actually find all of our back presentations on our YouTube channel. But next week, we are going to be joined by Brittany Struck, who is a fish biologist with NOAA Fisheries. And Brittany is going to be talking about what the salmon get up to when they actually make it out to the ocean. So many of us learn about the salmon life cycle in school. We hear how about they spawn and they grow, they move downriver, they go to the ocean, and then it's this big black hole mystery. What do they do for the 1 to 7 years out in the ocean? And then they come back and spawn again, and the whole cycle starts over. So Brittany's going to be with us next week to talk about what they're doing out in the ocean and how NOAA works to help ensure these healthy salmon populations, both by studying them and ocean conditions. If you are interested in learning more about water in California, you can always visit the DWR website, water.ca.gov. If you want to learn more about the Delta and the work we do there, we have a very brief, basic overview on our Water Basics page. And then we also have a lot of educational resources, which are free to parents and teachers. If you have kids at home learning right now, you have my sympathy or my empathy, whichever it is, when we're both experiencing the same thing. And that's water.ca.gov/education materials. And we have materials there on climate change, things that students can do to help address climate change and slow it down, as well as things that families can do together and students can do to help conserve water. So those two things that Brett talked about. We don't have a lot on salmon, but fortunately we have some great partners that do. So you can visit California Department of Fish and Wildlife.ca.gov. They have curriculum on salmon and information on salmon conservation. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about, go ahead, Brett.
I was going to say, I forgot to mention, a lot of those historical photos also came from the San Francisco Estuary Institute.
Mm-hmm.
They have some really interesting reports and tons of great pictures of like what this delta used to look like and what's going on now. So that's a really good resource as well.
Great. Yeah, San Francisco Estuary Institute.
SFEI.org.
All right, we'll put that into the comments section on our YouTube. And then the final thing I wanted to share was we went out and did a video with Brett out in the Delta on his research project earlier this summer. And so you can check out the video and an article about that on our DWR website. And you don't have to write these all down right now. We will put them all into the comments box on our YouTube channel. And to find the DWR YouTube channel, just go to YouTube and put in the search bar CA DWR, and it'll come up with these and other videos. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Brett. And
thank you.
Everybody's able to come back next week and hear from Brittany about the life of the salmon once they make it to the ocean.
I'll be tuning in for that.
Awesome. All right. Take care.